The alarm did not sound like anything I had heard before. It was not the dull chime we used for supply errors, and it was not the sharp double beep we used for pressure drops. This was a long, rising wail that filled every corridor of Station Verity at once, and it made my hands freeze over my console before my mind even understood why. I am Owen Blake. On that day I was a communications officer, one of only 6 humans stationed aboard a Vantar research outpost, sitting quietly on the edge of a region the Vantar called the Hollow Reach. My job was simple. I listened. I translated. I made sure that human ships passing through Vantar space understood the rules, and that Vantar officers understood us. It was not exciting work. Most days I drank cold tea and stared at empty channels. That day was different. The signal came in broken, chopped into pieces, as if something enormous had reached out and torn it apart before it could finish. I caught only fragments. A ship designation, a location deep inside the Hollow Reach, and underneath all of it, one word repeated over and over in the old Vantar emergency code. Help. I sat up straight and pulled the signal onto my main screen, running it through every filter I had. The static thinned for half a second, just long enough for me to hear a voice, tired and shaking, say something about hull failure and a swarm closing in from every direction. Then the signal died completely, and the screen went to a flat, silent gray. I looked around the control room. 3 Vantar officers stood near the main display, and none of them were moving toward their stations. They were watching the dead signal the way a person watches a candle go out in a dark room, waiting to see if it might spark again on its own. "That was the Solan Vale," said Commander Tess Orlin, the senior Vantar officer on the station. His voice was calm, but I had worked beside him long enough to hear the strain underneath it. "A survey vessel, 11 crew. Then we respond," I said. Tess turned to look at me, and for a moment his pale eyes held an expression I had never seen on him before. It was not anger, it was something closer to fear, carefully hidden behind procedure. "The Hollow Reach is under permanent quarantine, Officer Blake. You know this. No vessel enters without a full council review. There isn't time for a review. There are people dying right now." "There is always time for a review," he said, and I understood then that this was not stubbornness. This was training. The Vantar had built their entire civilization on patience, on caution, on the belief that speed without wisdom was the fastest way to lose everything. It had kept them alive for thousands of years, but it was going to cost 11 lives today. I watched him walk to the communication table and begin the slow, formal process of alerting the council. Forms had to be filled, officers had to be consulted, a vote would be scheduled, likely within the hour, possibly sooner given the circumstances. An hour. I did the math in my head and did not like the answer. I want to be fair to Tess. He was not a cruel man. He had shared meals with me, asked me questions about Earth with real curiosity, once spent an entire evening trying to understand why humans found humor in things that seemed to him deeply unfortunate. He believed in his system because his system had never failed him before. He simply did not understand that some doors close faster than any council can open them. I made a decision in the space of about 4 seconds, and I have never regretted it. I turned back to my console and opened a channel that I was technically not supposed to use without authorization. It connected to the Human Relay Network, a chain of listening posts and drift buoys that stretched from our small corner of Vantar space all the way back toward the nearest human systems. It was meant for routine traffic, status updates, supply requests. Nothing urgent ever came through it, which was exactly why nobody was watching it closely enough to stop me. "Blake, what are you doing?" Tess said, noticing the new light on my panel. "My job," I said, and pushed the distress signal through, unfiltered, exactly as it had come in, tagged with my own authorization code and a short message of my own. Confirmed distress. Vantar Survey Vessel Solan Vale, 11 crew, location attached, requesting immediate response. Tess crossed the room in 3 long strides. You cannot simply broadcast a quarantined signal into human networks without permission. There are treaties. There are boundaries. There's a ship full of people who might already be dead by the time your council finishes voting, I said. I'm not asking your permission, I already sent it. For a moment, I thought he might try to shut down my station entirely. His hand hovered near the console. But something in his face changed, and instead he simply stepped back and watched the confirmation light blink on my screen, over and over, steady and small, like a heartbeat. I did not know, in that moment, exactly what I had done. I knew I had broken protocol. I knew I might lose my position on the station, maybe worse. What I did not know was how fast that signal would travel, or what it would wake up on the other end. The human relay network was old but efficient, built by people who had learned, the hard way, that messages sometimes need to move faster than committees can approve them. My signal jumped from buoy to buoy, each one boosting it further, until it reached a relay station most people back home had never heard of, tucked quietly at the edge of a system with no name, only a designation number. It listened for signals like mine. I did not see what happened next. I only heard about it afterward, pieced together from records and from people who were there. But I have imagined it enough times that it feels almost like memory now. Deep inside that unnamed system, in a fleet anchorage that few outside our own military ever spoke of by its true name, lights that had been dim for months came on all at once. Ships that had been sitting quiet in low power drift began waking their reactors. Crew quarters that had been half empty filled within minutes, not hours. There was no debate, there was no vote, there was a verified distress call, and there were people alive somewhere who needed help, and that was the only fact that mattered. The alien analysts who occasionally observed this fleet from a careful distance had a name for it, half nervous joke and half genuine warning, whispered between species who had learned to fear how quickly humans could move once they decided something was worth moving for. They called it the Deathworlder fleet, not because humans had asked for the name, but because nothing else seemed to fit. I did not know, sitting in that quiet control room with Tess Orland standing beside me and the dead static of the Solan Veil still hanging in the air, that I had just pulled a sleeping giant out of its rest. I only knew that somewhere out there, 11 people were waiting for someone to come, and for the first time since I had arrived on Station Verity, I felt certain that someone would. The confirmation light on my console blinked once more, then steadied into a solid, unbroken glow. Message received. Message acknowledged. Response initiated. Tess Orland looked at that light for a long moment, then looked at me. "What have you done, Officer Blake?" he asked quietly, and I could not tell if the question was an accusation or something closer to wonder. I did not have an answer yet, but I would, soon enough. And so would he. Word of what I had done reached the Vantar Council within minutes, and word of what my message had triggered reached them not long after. I sat in the control room for the better part of an hour, watching Tess Orland pace back and forth, while status updates from human sources trickled in through channels I had never seen him access before. He was not shutting me out. He wanted to understand, and I respected that about him even as my stomach twisted with worry over the Solan Veil and its 11 crew members. "Explain this to me," Tess said finally, stopping in front of my station. "You sent one message, a single transmission, and already there are reports of ships moving in a fleet anchorage 6 systems from here. That should not be possible. Even our fastest response protocols require confirmation from at least 3 council members before a single vessel is authorized to leave dock. We don't work like that," I said. "Not for something like this." "Then how do you work?" I thought about how to explain it in a way that would make sense to someone raised inside a culture built on careful deliberation. The Vantar were not slow because they were foolish. They were slow because slowness had saved them from disaster more times than anyone could count. Their history was full of stories about hasty decisions that cost entire colonies, entire fleets, sometimes entire worlds. They had learned, painfully, that speed without agreement could be its own kind of danger. Humanity had learned something different, and it came from a much harder place. "Where I come from," I said, "we didn't get the luxury of slow decisions. Not in the beginning. Our planet is not gentle, Tess. It never has been. Storms that can level cities in an hour. Ground that shakes without warning. Diseases that spread faster than any council could ever debate a response. For most of human history, if you waited for a committee to agree before you acted, the people you were trying to save were already gone. So you learned to act without agreement. We learned to act on trust, I said. Trust that the people trained to respond know what they're doing. Trust that when someone says there's an emergency, you move first and ask questions later. It's not that we don't plan. We plan constantly. We drill for exactly this kind of moment, over and over, until the plan becomes instinct. So when the moment actually comes, there's nothing left to decide. There's only the doing. Thess was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that I think had been sitting underneath everything else he had said. And this fleet, the one now moving, what is it, exactly? I had heard the name before, mostly in passing, mostly from other humans, who said it with a strange mixture of pride and unease. I had never used it myself, not out loud, not to someone from another species. But it felt like the moment for honesty. Some of your people call it the Deathworlder fleet, I said. It's not an official name. We don't call it that ourselves. Not really. But I understand why the name stuck. Thess did not react the way I expected. He did not laugh, or dismiss it as an exaggeration born from fear. Instead, his expression grew more serious, and he moved to the main display, pulling up a series of reports that had clearly been compiled by Vantar intelligence over a long period of time. We have files on this fleet, he admitted. Old files, from before your species was fully integrated into wider galactic affairs. There were incidents, early in your history among the stars, where human forces responded to threats with a speed and a willingness to take losses that unsettled every species who witnessed it. Our analysts described your combat doctrine as reckless. Some called it primitive. A few, in private reports I was not meant to see, called it something closer to admiration, though they were careful never to say so where anyone might record it. We're not reckless, I said. We just don't treat risk the way you do. To us, hesitation has a cost too. You just don't always see that cost until it's too late. Far from Station Verity, in the fleet anchorage where my message had landed, that cost was being weighed in real time, though not with words. It was being weighed in the sound of boots against metal decking as crews moved to their stations. It was being weighed in the low hum of reactors climbing out of standby, one after another, faster than any Vantar engineer would have believed physically responsible. I did not witness this moment myself. I have since spoken with people who were there, and their accounts, though told from different corners of the fleet, all described the same strange, steady calm. There was no shouting, no panic, no last-minute scramble for information. The moment the distress call was verified, and it was verified within minutes thanks to the redundant systems built specifically for this purpose, the response was already underway. Ships that had spent months sitting quietly in low power drift, conserving resources, running only skeleton crews, came fully alive with a discipline that looked, to any outside observer, almost eerily rehearsed. That was because it was. Fleet Commander Nora Fenwick, who would later become a name I heard repeated often in the months that followed, was aboard her flagship reviewing routine maintenance logs when the alert reached her. She did not ask for confirmation twice. She did not call a meeting. She gave a single order, short and direct, and every ship under her command began moving in response before she had even finished speaking. I heard, much later, a recording of that order. It was almost disappointing in how ordinary it sounded. No dramatic speech, no rallying cry, just a voice, calm and certain, saying that there were people who needed help, and that the fleet was going to go get them. That was the entire foundation of everything that followed. Crews who had been resting came fully awake within moments, moving through corridors with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes only from endless repetition. Weapon systems that had been dormant ran through activation sequences that took seconds rather than the extended diagnostic periods most other species considered standard. Navigation officers began calculating jump routes to the Hollow Reach before official coordinates had even finished transmitting. trusting that the numbers would arrive in time to be plugged into calculations already half complete. It was not chaos. It was the opposite of chaos. It was a kind of controlled urgency that only makes sense once you understand that every person aboard those ships had trained for this exact scenario more times than they could count, until the actions required no thought at all, only muscle memory and trust in the people beside them. Watching from a distance, through sensor feeds shared cautiously by Vantar intelligence officers who had been monitoring the anchorage for other reasons entirely, several alien analysts reported a reaction that bordered on alarm. One report, which Thess eventually showed me, described the fleet's mobilization as, and I am quoting the translated words directly, an unsettling display of coordinated aggression achieved without any visible deliberation whatsoever. What they were seeing was not aggression. It was readiness. There is a difference, though I understood why it might be difficult to tell the two apart from a distance, especially for a species raised on the belief that any decision worth making required time to consider every angle first. Within 11 minutes of my original transmission reaching the anchorage, the first wave of the fleet was ready to depart. 11 minutes. I have thought about that number often since then. 11 minutes to move from full rest to full readiness, across dozens of vessels, thousands of personnel, without a single order needing to be repeated or clarified. Thess stood beside me as the final confirmations came through our shared monitoring feed, watching the fleet's formation lock into place on the display. His expression had shifted from the careful neutrality I was used to into something I had never seen on him before. It was not fear exactly. It was closer to the look a person gets when a belief they have held their entire life suddenly proves both true and far more serious than they had imagined. They are truly going, he said quietly, into the hollow reach, without full data on what destroyed the Solon Veil, without knowing what waits there. They know enough, I said. They know people need help. For us, that's usually enough to start moving. The rest gets figured out on the way. Thess said nothing for a long moment, watching the display as the fleet's navigation markers aligned into a tight, precise formation. Then, almost to himself, he said something that I have never forgotten. I do not know if that is bravery or madness. Perhaps for your people, there has never been a difference. I did not have a good answer for him. I am not certain there was one to give. On the display, the fleet's formation held steady for exactly 3 seconds, a final check running silently across every vessel at once. Then, without ceremony, without any dramatic countdown, the markers blinked and vanished from the screen entirely, swallowed by the folding of space itself as the ships translated into faster-than-light travel, gone from ordinary sensors in less time than it takes to draw a breath. The control room fell silent. Even the ever-present hum of the station's system seemed quieter somehow, as if the whole outpost was holding its breath along with us. How long until they arrive? Thess asked. I checked the projected numbers scrolling across my console, numbers that had already been calculated by systems back home before the fleet had even finished forming up. Not long, I said. Not nearly long enough for anyone who built their calculations expecting us to take our time. Thess looked at me, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something close to true uncertainty in his eyes, the look of a man watching the rules of his entire world begin to bend in ways he had never been trained to predict. Then we should hope, he said slowly, that whatever destroyed the Solon Veil is equally unprepared for what is coming. I hoped so too, but somewhere underneath that hope, I felt something else stirring, something I had not expected to feel while my own people rushed toward unknown danger without hesitation. I felt certain that whatever waited in the hollow reach, it had never faced anything quite like what was now folding through the dark toward it, moving fast, moving sure, and moving without the slightest intention of turning back. Thess arranged for us to travel aboard a Vantar liaison vessel that followed several hours behind the human fleet, close enough to reach the hollow reach before the situation resolved, far enough to avoid being caught in whatever waited there. I did not argue about my place on that ship. I needed to see this through, and I think Thess understood that better than he let on. The journey gave me time to learn exactly why the Hollow Reach carried the weight it did among the Vantar and their neighboring species. Thess showed me records going back generations, careful and cautious as always, but I could see in his manner that even discussing the region made him uneasy. Long before any of the current galactic community existed in its present form, an older civilization had built automated defense systems throughout that region, machines designed to protect something, though no surviving record explained exactly what. That civilization was gone now, vanished so completely that even their name had been lost, but their machines remained, patient and undying, activating whenever anything crossed too deeply into the space they guarded. The Vantar called them the Cinder Swarm, a name born from the scorched wreckage they left behind whenever a vessel wandered too close. Over the centuries, ship after ship had entered the Hollow Reach out of curiosity, greed, or simple bad luck, and ship after ship had gone silent. The region had been marked forbidden for longer than most current governments had existed, a quiet grave that everyone agreed to leave undisturbed. No fleet has ever engaged the swarm directly and survived intact, Thess told me as our ship approached the outer boundary of the Reach. Every previous encounter ended the same way. A vessel enters, the swarm activates, the vessel is destroyed before it can retreat. We do not send warships into the Hollow Reach, Officer Blake. We send warnings, and we hope others heed them. The Solon Vale didn't heed them. The Solon Vale was a survey vessel, mapping the boundary from what was believed to be a safe distance. Something must have gone wrong. A miscalculation, a drift in position. It should never have been close enough to trigger the swarm at all. I thought about the 11 crew members still out there, assuming any of them were still alive, and felt my stomach tighten again. And now our fleet is heading straight into the middle of it. Yes, Thess said simply, and I heard in that single word every fear his people had carried about the Hollow Reach for longer than human civilization had existed among the stars. We arrived at the boundary just as the first reports began filtering back from the human fleet, and what I saw on the shared display took my breath away. The Hollow Reach was not empty space. It was filled with wreckage, drifting silently in every direction, the remains of ships from a dozen different species scattered across centuries of failed attempts to enter or study the region. Amid that wreckage moved the swarm itself, thousands of small automated units, each one no larger than a shuttlecraft, moving with a coordination that looked less like a fleet and more like a single living organism spread across the dark. At the center of it all, badly damaged but still transmitting, was the Solon Vale, its hull scarred and venting atmosphere in slow, visible streams, surrounded on every side by swarm units closing in for what looked like a final, patient kill. The human fleet arrived exactly where the numbers said it would, translating out of faster-than-light travel in a tight formation that immediately began to spread, ships peeling away from the main group with a precision that made even Thess lean forward in his seat. I want to describe what happened next as clearly as I can, because I think it says everything about the difference between how our two peoples approach a crisis. A Vantar fleet, faced with the same situation, would have paused. They would have assessed the swarm's numbers, calculated survival probabilities, weighed the value of the Solon Vale's crew against the risk to the responding vessels, and only then, after careful deliberation, decided on a course of action. It is not cowardice. It is a philosophy built on the belief that a wasted life helps no one, and that careful thought prevents tragedy. The human fleet did none of that. Or rather, they had already done all of that, weeks and months earlier, in endless drills and simulations designed to prepare for exactly this kind of encounter. There was nothing left to calculate in the moment, because the moment had already been calculated 100 times before it ever arrived. Fleet Commander Fenwick split her forces immediately upon arrival. A fast strike group broke away toward the Solon Vale itself, moving to draw swarm units away from the crippled vessel and buy time for the crew still trapped inside. The remaining ships spread into a wide formation around the edge of the engagement zone, cutting off obvious retreat paths the swarm might use to regroup or reinforce itself from deeper within the Reach. The swarm reacted almost instantly, shifting its attention from the Solon Veil toward the new, larger threat. Thousands of small units began converging on the human ships, moving with the same eerie, coordinated precision that had destroyed every previous vessel foolish enough to enter their territory. I braced myself, half expecting to watch the same tragedy repeat itself in front of me, this time on a far larger scale. It did not happen the way I feared. The human ships did not scatter in panic, nor did they hold a tight, cautious line waiting to be overwhelmed. Instead, they moved with a strange, fluid aggression, ships breaking formation and reforming constantly, never staying in one position long enough for the swarm to concentrate its numbers effectively. It looked, from a distance, almost disorganized, the kind of tactic Thess would later describe as reckless improvisation. It was not disorganized, it was adaptive. Every human vessel was reading the swarm's movements in real time and adjusting instantly, trusting the ships around them to do the same without needing constant instruction. It was the same trust I had described to Thess back on Station Verity, playing out now on a battlefield instead of a control room, and it was working in ways that made even the swarm's patient, ancient programming begin to falter. "They are taking losses," Thess said quietly, watching a smaller human vessel vanish from the display, caught by a concentrated strike from a cluster of swarm units that had briefly outmaneuvered it. "They knew they would," I said, though my chest tightened at the sight regardless. "That doesn't mean they're losing." Thess did not answer. He was watching the strike group that had broken toward the Solon Veil, and I followed his gaze to see them cutting a path directly through the swarm units surrounding the crippled ship, absorbing strikes that would have destroyed a more cautious formation, refusing to slow down or fall back even as damage reports scrolled across the shared display faster than I could read them. They were not trying to survive the swarm. They were trying to reach the Solon Veil before it was too late, and every decision they made reflected that single, unwavering priority. I watched one human vessel take a direct hit that tore through its outer hull, watched it lose power along an entire section, and watched it continue forward anyway, weapons still firing, still holding position between the swarm and the ship it was there to protect. "That should not be possible," Thess murmured, more to himself than to me. "No vessel continues an engagement with that level of damage. Doctrine demands immediate withdrawal to preserve the crew." "Our doctrine demands something else," I said, my eyes fixed on the display, my heart pounding somewhere in my throat. "It demands you finish what you started, for the people you came to save." The swarm, ancient and patient as it was, had never encountered anything like this before. Every previous vessel that entered the Hollow Reach had either fled at the first sign of overwhelming force or held a defensive line until it was slowly, methodically dismantled. The swarm's entire strategy was built on those two predictable responses. The human fleet gave it neither. I watched the swarm's coordinated movements begin to fracture almost imperceptibly, small hesitations appearing in its formation as its ancient programming struggled to categorize an enemy that refused to behave the way every previous target had behaved. It was not enough to call it confused. Machines like that do not feel confusion the way we do. But something in its response patterns was shifting, adapting too slowly to keep pace with an enemy that adapted in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The strike group reached the Solon Veil just as its remaining atmosphere thinned to almost nothing, and I watched, breath held, as human vessels began matching course with the crippled ship, weapons still active, still holding the line against the swarm units still pressing in from every side. Thess turned to me, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something I could not quite name. "They are going to try to save them," he said. "In the middle of this, they are actually going to try." "They didn't come all this way to watch," I said, and on the display in front of us, the battle raged on, human ships weaving through wreckage and swarm fire alike, with a stubborn, relentless determination that I was only beginning to understand, had never once, in all of human history, known when to simply give up. The moment the battle turned did not announce itself with anything dramatic. There was no single decisive strike, no sudden collapse of the swarm's formation. Instead, I watched it happen slowly, piece by piece, as the human fleet's constant, unpredictable movement wore down a system built to counter threats that behaved in far more predictable ways. Fleet Commander Fenwick's strategy became clear only in hindsight. She had never intended to destroy the swarm through overwhelming firepower alone. She had intended to exhaust its ability to adapt, forcing it to spread its coordination across too many shifting targets at once, until its responses grew slower, less precise, more prone to the small hesitations that had begun appearing almost from the first moment of contact. Those hesitations grew wider as the engagement continued. Swarm units that had once moved with flawless, unified precision began breaking into smaller, less coordinated clusters, some pursuing human vessels that had already changed course, others holding position against threats that no longer existed. It was working, though I could see from the shifting damage reports that it was working at a cost no one aboard that fleet would walk away from unchanged. Inside the wreck of the Solan Vale, the situation had grown desperate in ways I only learned about afterward, pieced together from crew testimonies and recovered logs. The Vantar survey vessel had lost most of its main power hours before the human fleet ever arrived, its crew huddled in a single sealed section near the rear of the ship, air growing thinner by the hour, hull breaches spreading faster than emergency systems could seal them. Among the human vessels that reached the Solan Vale was a small rescue craft, little more than a shuttle, reinforced for emergency extraction work, carrying a two-person crew whose job was never meant to involve direct combat. One of them was a young technician named Ellie Pratt, barely 2 years into her service, trained for search and recovery operations rather than the kind of running battle unfolding around her. I met Ellie only once, months after the events in the Hollow Reach, and she described that day with a kind of quiet, matter-of-fact honesty that told me more about human character than any official report ever could. "We weren't supposed to be anywhere near the fighting," she told me. "Our job was to get in, get the survivors, and get out. But the swarm didn't care what our job was supposed to be. It saw a target, and it came for us the same as everything else." Her shuttle took damage twice on approach to the Solan Vale, losing part of its outer shielding and one of its 2 engines before it ever reached the crippled ship's hull. A more cautious pilot might have turned back, reporting the damage and requesting a safer approach once the area had been further secured. Ellie's pilot did not turn back, and Ellie herself did not ask him to. "There wasn't really a decision to make," she said. "There were people on that ship who were going to die if we didn't get to them. Everything else was just noise." They reached the Solan Vale's emergency airlock with their remaining engines straining and their shielding nearly gone, cutting through a jammed outer hatch by hand while swarm units continued to engage human warships only a short distance away, close enough that the flashes of weapons fire lit the darkness around them like distant lightning. Inside, they found the Vantar survivors exactly where the logs had indicated, 7 of the original 11 crew still alive, huddled together in a section of the ship that had lost heat along with everything else. 4 had not survived the hours before the fleet's arrival, a loss that Ellie described to me with a heaviness that had clearly never fully left her. "We couldn't save everyone," she said. "I think about that a lot, but we saved the ones we could reach in time, and I have to believe that mattered, even if it doesn't feel like enough some days." Among the 7 survivors was a young Vantar engineer, barely more than a child by her species standards, who had spent the final hours before rescue trying, unsuccessfully, to reroute power to the section's failing environmental systems. She was too weak to move under her own strength by the time Ellie's team reached her, and it was Ellie herself who carried her the final distance back to the shuttle, moving through a corridor still venting atmosphere, ignoring warnings from her own suit about the risks of remaining in that environment any longer than necessary. She kept apologizing, Ellie told me, a small, tired smile crossing her face at the memory. Even half-conscious, barely able to speak, she kept saying she was sorry for slowing us down. I told her she didn't have anything to apologize for. She wasn't the one who put any of us in that situation. That small act, One shuttle crew reaching one damaged ship among dozens of vessels fighting across a battlefield the size of a small star system would not have seemed significant on its own, but it was repeated, in different forms, across nearly every human vessel involved in that engagement. Crews took risks that Vantar doctrine would have called unacceptable, not out of recklessness, but because every one of them had internalized, long before that day, the simple belief that the mission was not complete until everyone who could be saved had been saved. Thess watched the recovered footage of that rescue alongside me weeks later, and I saw something shift in his expression that had been building since the moment the fleet first departed the human anchorage. "Your fleet commander did not order that shuttle to attempt the rescue under active fire," he said, more statement than question. "That decision was made by the crew themselves." "It usually is," I said. "We train people to make good decisions on their own, not just to follow orders without thinking." Fenwick trusted that crew to know what mattered in that moment, same as she trusted every other ship in her fleet to know what mattered without her having to spell it out for them. And if they had been wrong to make that decision, if they had been lost attempting a rescue that offered little chance of success? I thought about that question for a long moment before answering, because I did not want to give him an easy response to a question that did not have one. "Then we would have mourned them," I said, "and we would have understood why they made the choice they did, even if it cost them everything. That's the trade we accept, Thess. We would rather lose people who tried and failed than live with people who never tried at all." Wait. The battle in the Hollow Reach reached its final stage roughly 3 hours after the human fleet's arrival, though it felt, to those of us watching from the liaison vessel, like it stretched across an entire lifetime. The swarm's coordination, worn down by hours of unpredictable engagement, finally began to collapse entirely, its remaining units scattering into disorganized, easily contained pockets that the human fleet mopped up with a grim, methodical efficiency that felt almost anticlimactic after the chaos that had come before it. By the time the last swarm unit fell silent, drifting powerless among the wreckage of centuries past, the human fleet had lost 6 vessels entirely and suffered damage across dozens more. I later learned the human cost in lives numbered in the low hundreds, a figure that Fleet Command released without hesitation or attempt at softening, alongside a full accounting of every name. That transparency struck Thess more than almost anything else about the entire engagement. "You do not hide your losses," he observed, reading through the released reports with the same careful attention he gave everything. "Why would we?" I said. "Hiding them doesn't bring anyone back. It just makes it harder for the people who loved them to grieve properly, and harder for us to learn from what happened. We'd rather face it directly, even when it hurts." 7 Vantar survivors from the Solon Vale returned home to their families that week, a number that would have been 0 had the human fleet chosen the same cautious path the Vantar Council had originally intended to follow. I do not say that to diminish the Vantar approach, which had kept their people safe through centuries of careful decision-making. I say it because it illustrated, more clearly than any report or analysis could, the fundamental difference between our two peoples in a moment that truly mattered. News of the engagement spread quickly through Vantar space and beyond, reaching species who had, until that point, regarded humanity as an interesting but ultimately minor addition to galactic affairs, tolerated more out of curiosity than respect. The reports that followed described not just the destruction of a defense system that had stood unchallenged for longer than most civilizations could remember, but the manner in which it had been destroyed, and the reasons behind every decision that had led to that outcome. I remember reading one particular analysis, compiled by a neutral observer species with no particular loyalty to either the Vantar or humanity, that described the engagement in terms I have never forgotten. It stated plainly that the galactic community had significantly underestimated the operational philosophy of the human species, and that this underestimation carried consequences that extended far beyond a single engagement in a single forgotten corner of space. Thess read that same report standing beside me in the quiet aftermath of the battle, watching recovery teams move slowly across the wreckage field, searching for anything worth salvaging among the ruins of a system that had finally, after centuries, fallen silent. We built an entire diplomatic framework around the assumption that your people would eventually adopt our patience, our caution, given enough time among the stars," he said quietly. "I begin to suspect we were wrong." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe there's room for both. Your patience saved you from disasters we never had to face. Our willingness to move fast saved 7 people today who wouldn't be alive otherwise. I don't think either approach is wrong, Thess. I think the galaxy is big enough to need both, depending on the moment." He did not answer right away. He simply watched the wreckage field in silence, and I understood, without him needing to say it, that something fundamental had shifted in how his people would view mine from that day forward. Whether that shift would lead toward greater trust or greater caution, I could not yet say. But I knew, standing there among the drifting ruins of a battle that should never have been winnable by any reasonable calculation, that the galaxy's understanding of humanity had changed forever, and there would be no going back to the quiet, underestimated place we had occupied before. In the months that followed, I watched that change unfold from a front-row seat I had never asked for and was not entirely sure I wanted. Word of the Hollow Reach engagement traveled far beyond Vantar space, carried by traders, diplomats, and cautious intelligence networks belonging to species who had spent decades treating humanity as a curious but manageable presence at the edges of their affairs. The Vantar Council, the same body that had hesitated over procedure while 11 lives hung in the balance, called an emergency session within a week of the fleet's return. I was asked to attend as a witness, alongside Thess Orlin, whose standing among his own people had shifted noticeably since the events he had personally observed. He was no longer simply a cautious officer following established protocol. He had become, whether he wanted the role or not, one of the few Vantar voices who could speak with direct authority about what humanity was actually capable of, rather than relying on old reports and second-hand speculation. The council chamber was nothing like I expected. I had pictured something grand and imposing, but it was a modest room, quiet and functional, filled with representatives who spoke carefully and listened even more carefully, exactly the kind of measured environment that had shaped Vantar decision-making for generations. I sat near the back, feeling distinctly out of place, among beings who had built entire civilizations on patience I still did not fully understand. The debate that followed lasted nearly 3 full days, and I attended every session, partly out of duty, and partly because I found myself genuinely curious how a species built on caution would process an event that had upended so many of their assumptions. Some council members argued for tighter restrictions on human activity within Vantar territory, citing the very speed and unpredictability that had saved the Solan Vale's survivors as evidence of a dangerous instability that needed careful containment. One elderly representative, whose name I later learned was Councillor Vess Amrin, spoke at length about the risks of allowing a species with such willingness to accept losses to operate freely alongside more cautious neighbors, warning that what looked like heroism in one context might look like recklessness in another, with consequences that could not always be undone. I understood her concern, even if I did not entirely agree with it. Fear rarely comes from malice. It usually comes from watching something powerful behave in ways you cannot fully predict, and choosing caution over uncertainty. The Vantar had survived as long as they had precisely because they respected that instinct, and I could not fault them for feeling it now, directed toward us. Other voices in the chamber argued the opposite position with equal conviction. A younger representative named Doran Kell, who had reviewed the full engagement records personally, stood before the council and made the case that humanity's response to the Solan Vale distress call represented not a threat to be managed, but a capability the Vantar had spent generations wishing they possessed themselves, particularly in moments when caution came at too high a cost. "We have lost ships to the Hollow Reach for centuries," he said, and I remember his words clearly because Thess repeated them to me afterward with something close to quiet approval. "We lost them because our doctrine, however wise in most circumstances, offered no answer for a threat that required immediate, decisive action. The humans offered that answer within hours of learning it was needed." I do not believe we should punish them for a strength we ourselves lack. I believe we should learn from it, carefully, in our own way, without abandoning what makes us who we are. The council did not reach a unanimous decision, which Thess later told me was neither surprising nor unusual for a body built on deliberate compromise rather than swift consensus. What emerged instead was a cautious middle path, an agreement to establish a formal cooperative arrangement between Vontar Defense Forces and the human fleet, allowing for joint response protocols in situations that required speed the Vontar system could not naturally provide, while preserving Vontar authority over decisions made within their own territory under less urgent circumstances. It was not a perfect resolution. Some council members remained deeply uneasy about the arrangement, and I do not doubt that unease persists in certain corners of Vontar governance even now. But it was a genuine step forward, born not from blind trust but from a hard, honest reckoning with what had actually happened in the Hollow Reach, and what might have happened had that response never come at all. I thought often, during those long council sessions, about the moment that had started everything. A single decision, made in the space of a few seconds, to send a signal I was not authorized to send. I had not known, sitting at my console that day, that I was setting something so large into motion. I had only known that people were dying, and that waiting felt like the wrong answer. Fleet Commander Fenwick and I met only once, during a formal review of the engagement held several weeks after the Council's decision. She was not what I expected, though I am not sure exactly what I had expected. She was quiet, thoughtful, more interested in asking questions about the Vontar Council's reaction than discussing her own role in the battle. When I finally worked up the courage to ask her whether she had hesitated, even for a moment, before committing the full fleet to an engagement inside a region with a reputation like the Hollow Reach, she considered the question seriously before answering. "Hesitation costs time," she said, "and time costs lives. I trained my entire career to remove hesitation from the equation, not because I don't value caution, but because caution has its place, and that place isn't always in the middle of a rescue. We plan for the caution beforehand, in every drill, every simulation, every lesson learned from mistakes that came before us. By the time the moment actually arrives, the thinking is already done. All that's left is the doing." It was almost exactly what I had told Thess, weeks earlier, in a control room that felt impossibly far away now. Hearing it echoed back from the person who had actually led that fleet into the Hollow Reach gave the words a weight I had not fully appreciated when I first spoke them myself. Ellie Pratt, the young technician who had carried a dying survivor through a venting corridor without a second thought, was awarded a formal commendation for her actions, though when I spoke with her afterward she seemed almost uncomfortable with the recognition. "I didn't do anything special," she told me. "Anyone on that ship would have done the same thing. That's just what we do. You see someone who needs help, and you help them. It doesn't feel like it deserves a medal, it just feels like the only thing that made sense." I have thought about that statement often in the time since. Perhaps that is the truest measure of what makes humanity what it is. Not any single dramatic act of courage, but the quiet, widespread belief, held by nearly everyone trained within that culture, that helping someone in need is simply the only thing that makes sense, regardless of the risk involved. The 7 survivors of the Solon Vale returned to their lives gradually, each carrying the weight of what they had witnessed in their own way. I met with a few of them during the formal inquiry that followed the engagement, including the young engineer Ellie had carried to safety, whose name I learned was Vessa Tarn. She had recovered fully from her injuries by the time we spoke, though something in her manner suggested the experience had changed her in ways that would take much longer to fully settle. "I did not understand your people before that day," she told me, speaking slowly, carefully choosing her words the way I had come to recognize as characteristic of her species. "I had read about humans. I had even worked alongside a few briefly during my training, but I did not understand, not truly, until I was the one being carried through a dying ship by someone who had no obligation to risk her own life for mine." "She would tell you it wasn't really a choice," I said, "not the way you might think of one." "Perhaps that is what I find most difficult to understand," Vessa said. "For my people, Every significant action involves a choice, weighed carefully against its risks and its costs. For your people, it seems some choices are made before the moment even arrives, built so deeply into who you are that there is nothing left to weigh once the moment actually comes. I did not have a perfect answer for her, any more than I had for Tess weeks earlier. I am not certain humanity fully understands itself well enough to explain that difference in a way that would satisfy a species built on such careful deliberation. Perhaps it simply is what it is, a product of a difficult world that shaped us long before we ever looked up at the stars and wondered what waited beyond them. Back on Station Verity, life gradually returned to something resembling its old rhythm, though nothing felt quite the same as it had before the day the alarm sounded through every corridor at once. Tess Orlin and I continued working together, our roles largely unchanged on paper, though the trust between us had deepened into something I do not think either of us fully anticipated when we first began our posting together. "I owe you an apology," he told me one quiet evening, several months after the events in the Hollow Reach, as we reviewed routine reports together, in the same control room where everything had begun. "I questioned your judgment that day. I called your actions a violation of protocol, and in the strictest sense I suppose they were. But I have come to understand that some protocols exist to prevent disaster, and others exist simply because they have always existed, without anyone stopping to ask whether they still serve the purpose they were built for." "You don't owe me an apology," I said. "You were doing what your training told you was right. I understand that better now than I did back then. We just have different trainings, Tess. Doesn't mean either of us was wrong to trust the one we grew up with." He considered that for a long moment, then nodded slowly, the gesture I had come to recognize as his version of quiet agreement. "Perhaps that is the lesson worth carrying forward," he said. "Not that one approach is correct and the other mistaken, but that the galaxy is large enough and dangerous enough to require both kinds of wisdom, depending on what the moment demands." I found myself agreeing with him completely, and I told him so. The human fleet, the one so many species had come to know by the name they had given it rather than any official designation, returned to its quiet anchorage not long after the engagement concluded, settling back into the same low-power dormancy it had maintained for months before the Solon Vale's distress call ever reached it. From the outside it would have looked, once again, like nothing more than a collection of ships resting quietly at the edge of human space, unremarkable and easy to overlook. But something had changed, and everyone who had witnessed those events, human and Vantar alike, understood that the appearance of stillness now concealed something far more significant than it had before. Every species who learned the full story of what happened in the Hollow Reach carried away the same essential understanding, whether they welcomed it or feared it. Humanity's calm was not the absence of readiness. It was readiness itself, held quietly in reserve, waiting only for the moment it was needed. I think about that distinction often, even now, long after my posting at Station Verity came to its natural end and I moved on to other work within the wider network connecting human and Vantar interests. I think about the 11 minutes it took for an entire fleet to move from full rest to full readiness. I think about Ellie Pratt carrying a dying stranger through a venting corridor without a second thought, and about Vessa Tarn learning, in the most difficult way possible, what it meant to be helped by people who had never learned to hesitate when someone else's life was on the line. Mostly, I think about that first alarm, the one that did not sound like anything I had heard before, and about the 4 seconds it took me to decide that some rules exist to be followed, and others exist to be broken when the cost of following them is measured in lives that cannot be given back. I do not know what waits in the next distress call, wherever and whenever it comes. I do not know which corner of the galaxy will next discover, the way the Vantar discovered, exactly what it means to send a signal into the dark and have it answered by people who never learned how to wait. But I know this much for certain. Somewhere out there, in a quiet anchorage that looks, from the outside, like nothing more than a fleet at rest, the readiness never truly sleeps. It only waits, patient in its own restless way, for the next moment someone needs it enough to ask. And when that moment comes, however far away it might be, I have no doubt at all that the answer will be the same as it was that day in the Hollow Reach. Someone will hear the call. Someone will decide, in the space of a few short seconds, that waiting is not an option. And somewhere, against every careful calculation that says it should not be possible, help will already be on its way, before anyone else has even finished deciding whether to send it. That, more than anything else I witnessed during those strange and difficult months, is the truest measure of who we are.